Okay, so welcome everybody this evening. We are here as part of our series looking at potential solutions and innovation to tackle the climate and nature crises. Bedfordshire Climate Change Forum is thrilled to host J B Mackinnon, who's going to be talking about his new book, The Day the World Stopped Shopping, How Ending Consumerism Saves the Environment and Ourselves, which was published this year. He's also the author of A Short History of, Progress. Ronald Wright has described it as one of the most important and well-written books I've read. Mackinnon is an award-winning journalist, and his work has appeared in The New Yorker, National Geographic, and The Atlantic. He's an adjunct professor of journalism at the University of British Columbia. Among his other books are The 100-Mile Diet, A Year of Local Eating, and The Once and Future World, Nature as It Was, As It Is, and As It Could Be. So a huge welcome to James. We'll be taking questions for you at the end. The chat will be closed during your talk, so everyone, please have a think about what you'd like to ask, and we'll open it up for a Q&A then. But for now, without further ado, I present to you J B Mackinnon.
Thanks so much, Pip. And thank you, everybody, for attending. It's a real pleasure to be a part of this big green week, even if I am 7,500 kilometers away. Very much there with you in spirit. I hope you'll be able to overlook this object in front of my face, which of course is a microphone. It is meant to make my voice sound more mellifluous and as though I'm really in the room with you at this great distance. Hopefully that works. I wanted to start by talking about why I ended up writing a book-length thought experiment about what would happen if the world stops shopping. And it really comes down to the fact that I've spent many years now working as an environmental journalist and an environmental writer. And I gradually began to realize that it didn't really matter which environmental issue, which specific issue I was looking at. If I thought back to the root causes of that issue, it was overconsumption. Just this fact that we are consuming more of the Earth's resources than is sustainable. That was my instinct. I didn't know at this point that this was a certain fact. But in 2019, the UN panel that studies global natural resources released a report, and by their estimate, sometime around the turn of the millennium, overconsumption surpassed population growth as the biggest driver of our environmental crises. So, in other words, how much each one of us consumes now matters more than how many of us there are. And if you have trouble picturing how that works, here's a statistic that might help. And I have to apologize in advance because the statistic can sometimes feel uncomfortable for people, but the statistic is this: the average person in the world's richer countries is now consuming 13 times as many resources as the average person in a poorer country. So that means that if you are a family of four in one of the wealthier nations of the world, one of the big consuming countries of the world, then your family of four is consuming as much as 52 people in one of the lower consuming, generally poorer countries of the world. So I've traveled a lot. I am an over-consumer when it comes to traveling. I have never seen a 52-person family in any of these countries that I've visited. So increasingly, it is the wealthy consumers of the world who are driving problems like climate change, habitat loss, deforestation, and toxic pollution. And in fact, I actually set out at one point in my research for this book to try to find and identify problems that still were rooted mainly in overpopulation. And this still does happen, of course. I mean, there are areas, for example, that are drawing on a limited supply of fresh water. And if you have too many people drawing on that supply, you can end up with a water shortage driven by population. But increasingly, even things like the depletion of fresh water is driven by consumption by people from far, far away. So, for example, in the past 20 years, the number of articles of clothing that we buy has doubled in the last 20 years. So it takes a lot of water to produce clothing. As a result, some of the most water-stressed places on Earth are now running out of water, not mainly because of the populations of people that are in that area drawing on that fresh water source, but because the water is, mainly because the water is being used to produce cotton, produce and manufacture cotton to be used in clothes that are purchased by consumers in faraway countries like Canada, where I live, in the UK, where you are. Now, if we're consuming too much, then an obvious solution is to consume less. Less goods, less services, less experiences, to buy fewer clothes, to travel less often, these sorts of things. Now, the trouble with reducing consumption in that manner is that it's bound up in this dilemma. So the planet needs us to stop consuming so much, but the economy seems to need us to keep consuming, and in fact, to keep consuming more and more. And we saw this dilemma really clearly at the start of the pandemic, where cut off from consumer culture and the consumer economy, people around the world consumed less, and we saw some really interesting results. We saw some of the cleanest, clearest air anyone could remember, and the differences were most striking in the cities in Asia that produce a lot of the world's consumer goods. They went from profoundly polluted air to blue skies in some cases. We also saw the sharpest drop in carbon emissions ever recorded. We saw a resurgence in the natural world, all those videos of animals retaking places where the hand of human pressure had been lifted. Probably everyone has their favorite from those videos. Mine was of a beach in Mexico, where as mass tourism receded around the world, American crocodiles took over the beach, and they were the ones who were sunbathing and swimming and even surfing in the waves. But of course, at the same time, businesses were struggling to survive. Incredible numbers of people lost their jobs and livelihoods. At one point, there were 1 million garment workers in Bangladesh alone who were out of work during the early lockdowns. So the really important question I started to realize is not like, are we consuming too much? We are. We know we are. There's very little debate in the research around that. The big question is there any way that we can consume less without triggering the collapse of civilization? That's the question that I wanted to explore in this book. And the way I thought I could do it is by running this thought experiment where I stop shopping. I stop the world shopping on the written page and play out what might unfold. Now, I need to step back here to say that we do already have one answer to that question of whether or not we can stop shopping and do so without triggering a massive economic collapse. The answer that we've been working with is green consumption. So the idea behind green consumption is that we can find a way to keep consuming more or less the way we are, but without it having the environmental impacts and consequences that we have right now. So this is sometimes called decoupling. The idea is that we can decouple our consumption from its environmental impacts. Now, I first heard about decoupling at the Earth Summit in Johannesburg, South Africa, again, sometime fairly close to the turn of the millennium. And as it turns out, that summit was held in a building that was adjacent to one of South Africa's largest luxury malls. And I remember hearing about decoupling and thinking, is this possible? And then walking down through this mall that was many stories high and just filled with the huge array of consumer goods that we draw on today. And I remember thinking, we're somehow going to decouple all of this from its ecological consequences. And I had trouble believing that we could. At the very least, it seemed like it was going to be a very difficult thing to achieve. And I'm not going to go very deeply into this subject here. There's quite a bit about this in the book. But I will say that it has turned out to be a very difficult thing to achieve. So after 20 years of trying to green consumption and approaching our environmental problems as something that we might decouple from our consumer culture, we're consuming more of nearly every resource than we were before. Gravel, gold, timber, fish, you name it, we are consuming more of it. And the most spectacular failure, in my opinion, has been our attempts to decouple consumption from carbon emissions. So we've had truly impressive advances in green technology and renewable energy, and yet we still haven't had a single year, not a single year, in which global carbon emissions have actually dropped as a result of those things, as a result of green tech and clean energy. It's still the case that the only times in history that carbon emissions have dropped at a global scale have come during circumstances like big recessions, world wars, the global pandemic, periods when people stop consuming, when they stop shopping. So actually consuming less rather than greening our consumption is pretty clearly the most effective way we know of to reduce carbon emissions and slow climate change and in fact to reduce impacts of all kinds on the environment. But it takes us back to that question: can we do it without a recession or a pandemic or a war? I believe the answer to that question is yes. So let's look at how that might happen in sort of a small scale. And I think this is an area that probably everyone can agree on, which is that most of the things we buy now are not as well made as they used to be. And this is not just nostalgia, by the way. So I said earlier that we buy about twice as many clothes as we did 20 years ago. Part of the reason that we buy twice as many clothes is because those clothes last half as long as they used to. So clothes are now made so badly that they often don't even have very much life as secondhand products. If something is poorly made, it doesn't really matter whether you buy it new or you buy it secondhand. Its lifespan is not going to be long enough to slow down the cycle of clothing replacement. So to look at this from a different angle, I met with a woman named Amanda Rinderly, and she's the CEO of a company called Tuckerman, and their mission has been to produce the most sustainable dress shirts on earth. I'm not sure if dress shirts is a term you use in the UK, but I'm referring here to the kinds of shirts that people wear to the office. So Tuckerman has set out to produce the most sustainable dress shirts. They try and do it through sustainable production, like organic cotton, things like that. And they also try and do it through making shirts that will last for a very long time. Now, a typical Tuckerman shirt costs $195 US. That's about 140 British pounds. So you can see right there that there's a challenge in shifting towards more durable products. I looked it up. You can buy a dinner shirt at Marks and Sparks for 20 pounds. And that's not even the cheapest dress shirts on the market in the UK. So those shirts won't last very long, but I don't think most people care. They understand that they can simply buy another one. A lot of people simply don't have the money to put 140 pounds down up front for a shirt. And if the difference in price is between 20 pounds and 140 pounds, 120 pounds difference in price, you can see that we've got a problem. And this helps illuminate one of the key ideas that emerged out of the research I did for the book for me. And that it's probably not going to work to just keep telling people that they should buy less stuff or that they should buy more durable stuff even. We can scold people for not buying more durable things, but if the price difference is that great, they're simply not going to do it. Instead, what I think is more hopeful approach is that we can change society and the economy in ways that make it easier for people to choose to buy less and to keep things longer. So again, going back to Amanda Rinderly and her company Tuckerman, I talked to her about why her products are so expensive. And she said it's not mainly because so much more labor goes into them or because the materials themselves are inherently more expensive. There's an element of that. But the main reason they're more expensive is because she's trying to make good quality things in an industry that's entirely organized at this point around making cheap disposable things. So for example, Tuckerman wanted to use high quality organic fabric to make its shirts. Well, she had to phone 500 different companies before she found one that was still producing that kind of fabric. It was a small family-owned company in Italy. So she's unable to benefit in any way from economies of scale. Everything that they want to do to make their shirts sustainable and durable is niche in today's market. And therefore very expensive. So here's another thing I thought was very interesting is we've all heard of organic cotton and the fight to try to make more of the world's cotton supply come from areas where the cotton is organically grown. Well, that turns out there's another fight that needs to happen. And that fight has to do with something called long staple cotton. So if you want to make durable cotton fabrics, you want long staple cotton. That means that the cotton fibers are longer, and that allows you to make finer thread and more durable material. But there's so little demand for long-lasting clothing today that there isn't a lot of long staple cotton available. And Tuckerman not only wants long staple cotton, it wants organic long staple cotton in order to make sustainable, durable products. 1% of the cotton market is organic cotton. That means the fraction of the cotton market that is organic and long staple, the kind of cotton you need to make sustainable, durable products, is a fraction of 1%. So huge challenges to try to make something that lasts in the system that's been recreated to make things that are cheap and disposable. The good news is that when you look at that, you can see that there are concrete steps that we can take to move back towards a system of greater durability and lower disposability. So we can do things like put lifespan labels on products so that people are more likely to choose to buy something that's a little more expensive because they know it will last longer. We can reduce taxes on repair and maintenance of products. We can increase taxes on the production of new products. We can lower taxes on the sale of secondhand products. We can do these sorts of things that encourage people to repair and reuse and resell things, and to less often prefer to buy the new thing. We can raise carbon taxes so that it makes less sense to ship things around the world for manufacture and more sense to produce them locally. Talking to Amanda at Tuckerman, I said, if I gave you the magic wand, what is one thing that you could do that would make the biggest difference to your ability to produce sustainable, durable goods? And she said it would be to build the costs of the environmental impacts of products into the price of those products. So that means that would change things in such a way that buying new things would be, or buying durable things would be much more cost competitive with buying disposable things. So just a change like that, although it's a large change, it's something that we can do. It's a concrete thing that we can do to create a lower consuming society. Now, moving back towards an economy where we buy fewer but better things, that's just one of the many things we might do to create a lower consuming society. But let's jump back out to the big picture and just ask, what does the economy of a lower consuming society look like? Would it be as big an economy as we have now, for example. I mean, this is a concern when it comes to this question of, will it trigger the collapse of civilization? And I think the best answer I can give to that right now is we don't know. No one really knows what that economy would look like. But my guess is that a deconsumer economy, as I call it, wouldn't be as small as most people think. So for example, it takes more labor to produce good quality things. That means if you're producing quality thing or more things of quality and fewer things of quantity, then that might not cost as many jobs as a lot of people think. We also pay more for higher quality things. So consumer spending might not be reduced as much as you might think if we reduce consumption. And then there are whole sectors of the economy that can actually grow in a lower consuming society. So things like repair and maintenance would grow, secondhand sales would grow, the sharing economy might grow, the market in secondhand products would grow. And there were times in the past when all of these sectors were larger parts of the economy than they are today. So that's something that could be possible again in the future. All that said, to be completely honest with you, I think that a lower consuming economy would ultimately be possibly smaller and certainly slower growing than the economy we have today. So is that automatically a disaster? That question I took to an economist, a Canadian economist named Peter Victor, and he spent the last couple of decades building and refining a computer model of the Canadian economy. And at this point, it's so well composed that he can dial up or dial down any part of the Canadian economy and hit the run button and see what happens. So I went to Peter Victor and I said, can we make Canada stop shopping? Can we have an overnight halt in consumer, or sorry, an overnight cut in consumer spending by 50%? And he agreed to do this. Now, as we saw in the pandemic, when that kind of thing happens, if we all stop shopping, then business and government will immediately try to do a bunch of other things to make us get back to shopping. They will, businesses will reduce prices, governments will, in some cases, cut us checks, send them to us in the mail to encourage us to shop. World leaders will literally, go to the hustings and ask us to get back to the malls. Peter made sure in his computer model that none of those things would work. In our experiment, Canadians stopped shopping and they stuck with it, and nothing government or business did would make them change. So we hit the run button on a 50% drop in consumer spending, and charts started popping up in the model, and it was a total disaster, Debt and unemployment were off the charts. Investors were losing millions of dollars. The average household ended up paying 60% in taxes just to keep society afloat. Peter actually looked at me at one point and said, I think you might be killing capitalism. And, but then he suggested a different experiment. He said, why not, instead of cutting consumer spending by 50% overnight, why don't we slow consumer spending by 4%? So he punched that in. We ran the model, and once again, it was a disaster. It was quite a deep recession. But this time, he went in and made some adjustments. So one thing he did was shorten the work week so that people were working, the average person would be working 4 days a week instead of 5. So if this was a smaller, slower churning economy that produced less work, then that work would be spread more evenly. He slowed the growth of the Canadian population a little bit, and that also reduced demand for work. He increased green investment. He also adjusted taxes so that the wealth that was being produced by this slower churning economy was being spread more equitably between the people in the Canadian population. So with these changes, he was able, in his computer model version of Canada, he was able to create a stable society that it was consuming a lot less. It provided nearly everybody with an adequate standard of living for most people, at least as adequately as, or at least as equitably as Canada currently does. He reduced income inequality. He provided more people with more free time, and Canada reached zero carbon emissions faster than it would have if it had focused strictly on green tech and clean energy solutions. So Peter describes that economy as an economy that's slower by design, not disaster. So this is maybe the most important point that came out of this, is that I think we're afraid of moving in the direction of a lower consuming society because our only knowledge of that comes from disasters. It comes from recessions, pandemics, and wars. We've never tried to make a lower consuming society. Now, if we did, and if we succeeded, what kind of people might we become? What would we be if we were deconsumers instead of consumers? And this is a question that I was actually exploring just before the pandemic struck. And what stands out in my memory is a conversation I was having with Tim Kasser, and he's probably the foremost psychologist who studies materialism in the world today. So when I say materialism, I think people what often immediately comes to mind are, the worst kind of materialists, people who are, love to show off their wealth, people who, love to own a dozen cars, these kinds of things. But materialism is a part of nearly everybody's value set these days. It's a set of values and beliefs that focus on the importance of income, possessions, and social status. That's all materialism is. Materialism revolves around what psychologists call extrinsic values. And so these are values that give us satisfaction mainly when they're recognized by other people. So for example, being fashionable is an extrinsic value. You might take genuine self-satisfaction or pride from your good taste in clothes and your sense of fashion. But really, in order to be fashionable in society, you need to be recognized as such by other people whose opinions matter to you. You need to hear from them that you look great and you're well-dressed and you've got great taste, these sorts of things. There's another set of values, though, and they are called intrinsic values. And intrinsic values are inherently satisfying to us. They satisfy us directly, internally, and without the need for external approval or support. So an example of an intrinsic value is having strong friendships would be an example. So people might admire you and you might get external approval for having a close set of friends, but you don't need that external approval for having close friends and strong friendships to be satisfying. They just are. Now, here's something that I thought was really interesting about this, is that I think I, like a lot of people, had the perception that we pursue extrinsic values and materialism and consumerism more than we do intrinsically satisfying values, because culture's corrupted and we're getting greedy and covetous and these sorts of things, so that people are awful and in short. But that doesn't turn out to be the case. A lot of the research indicates that even in our the most consumeristic, most materialistic societies, most people still say that intrinsic values are the most important. People still say that their top priorities should be family and friends and good health and giving back to their communities, these sorts of things. The reason we often fail to pursue intrinsic values instead of extrinsic values is not because we don't think they're important. It's often because it's a question of time. So there's only so many hours in the day. And if we fill a lot of our time with the pursuit of materialism and consumerism, if our priorities are things like earning money, spending money, filling our schedules with activities and so on, then we simply have less time to pursue intrinsically satisfying values. So I was on the phone with Tim Kasser talking about all of this stuff, and I asked him, if we stopped shopping tomorrow, we cut ourselves off from materialism and consumerism, how quickly would we make the shift from principally pursuing extrinsic values to principally pursuing this alternative set of intrinsically satisfying values? And his answer was, well, I don't know. There's not enough research on that subject. So that phone call took place on January 30th, 2020. And later that same day, the World Health Organization announced a global health emergency related to the coronavirus, of course. And within a couple of weeks, millions of people were locked away from consumer culture. And what we saw was that people were able to make the turn towards intrinsic values very, very quickly. So we already seem to be forgetting that brief period, right? When the consumer economy was truly closed. People were afraid to go shopping. People were afraid even to bring outside materials into their home, like to order things to their homes for a period of time. The economy hadn't yet reorganized itself around the fact that everybody was indoors and would need door-to-door delivery and advertisements aimed at our new indoor lockdown lives and all of these sorts of things. The world genuinely stopped shopping in a manner very similar to what I had been exploring in my book. Now, it was a tragic time for many people, of course, but I'm sure you'll remember that there were some other major trends as well. The news media described an epidemic of kindness in that period. There was a huge wave of people reaching out to friends and family, often people that they hadn't spoken to for years. So there was this famous trend towards baking sourdough loaves and gardening and things like this. In other words, mastering new skills, which is something that's known to be intrinsically satisfying. People were pursuing physical fitness. People were spending more time in nature and paying attention to nature. There's still a debate about whether there were actually more birds in cities and towns in 2020, or whether we were just paying more attention and noticing the birds. There was also a sudden surge of interest in social justice movements like Black Lives Matter. And that surge is hard to explain in any other way than that people suddenly had more time to pay attention to issues like that and more openness to be empathetic to the struggles of other people. So these are exactly the kinds of results that psychological research would predict would happen if people turn away from materialism and consumerism and towards this alternative set of intrinsic values. It's also, this is also exactly the pattern that people often follow when they start to shift towards practicing simpler living. The way that they make meaning in their lives is by drawing on this set of intrinsic values rather than the extrinsic values that motivate materialism and consumerism. So in the pandemic, we saw that a society can begin to make the shift towards this alternative set of values very, very quickly. Now, this I thought was one of the most important insights ultimately to come out of the pandemic for me. I mean, as I was writing this book, I wanted to explore how things might change if the world stopped shopping. I wanted to know how the ecology would change, how the economy would change, how our products would change, and how we ourselves would change. And in the end, it's that last point, we ourselves, like what might happen to us that I think matters most. And I mean, I'm convinced that consuming less is the best, most powerful route we have towards saving the planet. But if we're going to save the planet, a lot more of us need to become the kind of people who will save a planet. And I think it's pretty hard to imagine, as I think of it, it's pretty hard to imagine that a world of consumers is going to save the planet. I think we need a different kind of citizen to carry that off. I think I'll leave it at that, and thank you for listening. And I'd be happy to try to answer any questions you might have.
Well, thank you so much, James. That was brilliant. And may I just say, it's only a snapshot of what's in the book, which I would hugely recommend to everyone. If you would like to start typing your questions in the chat, then we will take them from there. If you would like to ask a question in person, pop your name in the chat and say you'd like to do that, and I can call your name out. I'll start off with a quick question from me whilst you're having a think about what you would like to ask. There's a phrase you use in the book called affluence without abundance. Could you explain what that's come to mean to you as a result of your research?
Yeah, this idea, affluence without abundance, comes out of anthropology, actually, where they look at different kinds of cultures. And you have some cultures that try to meet people's needs by producing much, and other cultures that meet their needs by having few needs. And affluence without abundance draws on that tradition. So the idea that you can feel affluent if you don't feel that you require a lot of consumer goods or services in your life, then you can feel affluent because you don't need to you don't need to access as many of those things. You don't need to feel as though you need to earn enormous amounts of wealth in order to meet your needs. You can instead enjoy things like free time and freedom and the time to invest in these other kinds of this other kind of value system. And that's what's reflected in. I had a lot of conversations with people who are practicing various kinds of simpler living in all different kinds of parts of the world. And this is something that all of them share in common, is that when I talk to them, there's very little sense of sacrifice or loss. And in its place, there's actually a sense of abundance. Most people say they start to feel, quite affluent because they meet their needs. They continue to accumulate, wealth. They don't have debt. They often have savings. They often feel more freedom to quit a bad job, move to a different one, things like this, because they know that they can meet their needs more easily than people who are deeply in debt, dedicated to purchasing a larger house, purchasing a second home, purchasing a more expensive car, sending their kids to really expensive college, buying a steady stream of goods. A lot of those other people have a lack. Despite enormous wealth, people often have a very serious lack of a sense of affluence.
Thank you. And one of the things in the book you talk about is the Ecuadorian way of life, saying that might be globally replicable for one planet living. How different do you think it would feel to someone living in a country like ours if it happened overnight?
Yeah, if we were to shift to an Ecuadorian standard of living, some of us would be deeply shocked and some of us wouldn't be, I think. So the reason I went to Ecuador was because probably need to explain this a little bit with some background. So most people have probably heard of this idea that, for example, America if everyone lived like the average American, we would need 5 planet Earth's worth of resources to sustain that lifestyle for everyone. And it's different figures for different countries. I think for the UK, it's about 2.5 planets if we all lived like the average person from Britain. Generally it's unsustainable throughout Europe, North America, Japan, Australia, and so on. But I got thinking that, well, this must also mean that there are some countries where if we all lived like the average person in country X, then we could live with just 1 planet's worth of resources. And then I narrowed that in. I mean, that turns out to be true. But then I also narrowed in on which countries were consuming at that 1 planet level, but also had a high development, were characterized as having a high degree of development by the United Nations. So there's not so many of those countries. Ecuador is one of them. The lifestyle of the average Ecuadorian is totally recognizable to most of us. It's just that everything, as I put it in the book, it's as though everything shrunk in the wash. People do less of everything that we do. Fewer people have cars. If they have cars, they drive them less often. They own fewer things. They take fewer trips. It would be typical of a average Ecuadorian never to have flown in an airplane or to have done so very rarely. That actually is also true of quite a few low-income earning people in some of the richest countries of the world. So if we say, would it be recognizable to people? It would be recognizable to some people in countries in the wealthier parts of the world. And as I say, it'd be very shocking to some people who are used to taking 5 international trips a year, living with enormous material wealth. They would find that shift, profoundly, that would be a profound change for a lot of people. It's also recognizable really to anybody who has a clear memory of the post-war period in the UK or the 1960s, 1970s. For a lot of people in countries like Canada and the United States, we were consuming dramatically less in those eras, and yet life was people who lived through those times report that life was livable, and life satisfaction was not that different in that period than it is now.
Great, thank you. Okay, so first up we have a question from Lucy, who said, can you tell us a bit more about green demarketing, saying it's something that she hadn't come across before, and is it more than a gimmick?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure I have an answer to it, but I'll say what green demarketing is. So green demarketing is the idea that you kind of unsell your products to your customer base, in the sense that you try to convince people through your marketing to consume the products you produce responsibly. So the famous example of this is Patagonia. Patagonia's Black Friday ad that I think was in 2012. And it was a full page ad in the New York Times, and it said, "Don't buy this jacket." And it told people why they shouldn't. It said, the production of the jacket consumes this much water, it produces this many carbon emissions. Do you really need this jacket? The irony, of course, is that not only did sales of that jacket not drop, Patagonia sales overall grew and continue to grow despite the fact that they are taking this kind of green demarketing approach. That's not necessarily hypocritical. The first thing, I think most people's initial response is a cynical response. But I've talked quite a lot to the people at Patagonia, and their perspective on it is that right now there's an opportunity for companies to grow around this different value set of reducing consumption. So they are finding deconsumers. they're eating up the deconsumer market right now because they don't have any competition. The question, I guess, is what happens when you have more and more people who are consuming less. and you have more companies that are competing for the fewer product sales that these lower consuming people are engaging in, at some point, it seems like all of these companies have to stop growing or in fact shrink.
Okay, so a question from Diana, who says, thank you very much. She said, you mentioned the importance of incorporating externalities, costs of the environmental impacts, into existing pricing as a means to make sustainably produced goods more competitive. Could you please indicate the policy or fiscal mechanisms that could do this? Is it dependent on the state?
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't indicate those policies. The book I've written was not a deep investigation into the specific policies that would drive these things. It was an attempt to highlight the principles that we would need to bring to a lower consuming society. And the inclusion of externalities, that is the social and environmental costs of the production of products into the price of those products, that seems to be one of the key principles. But I'm not a policy analyst, and I can't say what the best way of doing that is. I'm sure there are people who are much more able to do so than I am. That said, we're doing it right now with carbon taxes, right? So carbon taxes are an attempt to build externalities into the price of goods. Things that we've learned from that, I think, are that it doesn't have to be precise. A great anxiety about this for a long period of time was that, well, what precise price would we put on carbon or copper or pollution or these sorts of things. So we have learned, I think, through carbon taxes that it doesn't necessarily have to be precise to be effective. It's important that it occur.
Okay, so Emily says she is an ethical and sustainable investment specialist. So I think we'll be very interested to hear from her, possibly for a future event, maybe. Said she's keen to spread the word on using shareholder pressure to make an impact. I believe we need to make companies behave more responsibly through the provision of investment capital. Do you think consumers are fully aware of the impact that they can have? So many people are recycling and behaving sustainably, but their pensions are still invested in oil companies and unethical companies. How do we empower people to get impact through their pensions and investments?
I don't think that most people are fully aware of the impact that they have, and how we can empower them. I think mainly through the usual means of education, campaigning, trying to build the public dialogue around these issues. Investment is a complicated one when it comes to reducing consumption, though, because money is a big problem. I discuss this in the book, but money is tricky in a deconsumer society because right now, every dollar that's spent has predictable impacts in terms of carbon emissions and the environment. So one of the concerns is that if people buy fewer things, what do they do with the savings, right? If they invest it, they will be investing in companies that produce products for the consumer economy. If they save it, then the only difference is that the bank will do that for them. It's quite a challenging issue. The expert that I talked to about this, who's a rebound effects expert in Spain, he ultimately said there's very few things that we can do with our money that genuinely reduces the impacts of our consumption. And those things would be things like, potentially paying more to buy products that will prevent us from buying products in the future, or donating money to, for example, donating money to help people who are not even meeting their basic consumer needs to meet those needs without adding on to our own consumption. Or investing in the protection of the land, protecting land from resource exploitation. But they ultimately, he said, the best thing we can do is burn the money. And, that one's going to take some thinking through.
That's certainly an interesting point for people to think about. I will ask Colin's question in a moment, but I thought of one that I did want to ask is that imagine we did reduce spending by 25%, as you advocate in the book, worldwide. If you were to arrive somewhere like Toronto or London in 10 years' time, how different do you think it would look to stand in sort of the middle of the city and look around? Like, do you think it would feel different to how it is now? Would it be physically different? Would it just be mentally different?
Oh, I mean, I think it would definitely appear different. And in fact, you can kind of see this in Japan. So Japan's another place I went in my very high consuming research tour. And Japan hasn't really had a lot of growth in its economy for about 30 years. So it's also having depopulation, which is drawing down its consumer spending because people are dying off and they aren't being replaced. And you can see in Japan that things are aging and not being replaced at the same rate. You really, in the same way that when I flew back from Ecuador and I landed in the United States, that I noticed suddenly, or I realized suddenly, how much less advertising there was in Ecuador than there was in the United States. I mean, an incredible difference. And I think you'd have that same kind of sense. If you flew from Vancouver to Tokyo, then you see that a lot of Tokyo is really aging and weathering, and there's people are buying fewer clothes. People wear older clothes. People drive older vehicles. These sorts of things are starting to happen as people consume less and hang on to what they have for longer periods of time. And so I think you would notice those sorts of things. And the Japanese do it very well. They have a whole aesthetic built around the idea of weathering and aging and patina and these sorts of things. That's makes it very attractive. But I mean, I think you would also see, I wouldn't completely separate, I don't completely separate the idea of reducing consumption from green technology and renewable energy. Those things they can be very important to reducing the consumption of resources, but they work best in combination with reducing consumption. So I think we'd see those sorts of changes. A lot more goods that are accessed through sharing, more durable products, more public transit, all of these other more familiar changes as well, bike lanes, all of these sorts of things can contribute and be a part of all of that.
Great. I look forward to rocking up in it. So Colin asked, do you have any sense that governments might take up the approach you advocate, and what forces oppose it?
I mean, many forces oppose it, I think. I think right now it is still the primary view of business that it is the absolutely dominant view is that we should continue to pursue a perpetually growing consumer-driven economy. That's the absolutely dominant view. So I would say this idea has made very little headway at this point into government or business. But that's not the same as saying it's made no headway. So we do see things like, France has passed a law against planned obsolescence. Sweden has reduced taxes on its repair sector and its maintenance sector. We do see a conversation in Europe around lifespan labeling for products, for example. So this sort of area, you are seeing some gains. There are companies like Patagonia and other companies that are starting to make this shift to a model where their business model isn't entirely predicated on the production of new goods, and will include potentially things like repair and maintenance, or will include sharing, or will include secondhand. Levi's is probably the largest, most recognizable brand that has taken a turn in this direction, and did so earlier this year, where they actually stated outright that the clothing industry is founded on overconsumption, and that buying less will always be more effective than buying green. Levi's is saying that in part because they recognize that they are associated in people's minds with producing more durable products. It's advantageous to them, but it's still a very important shift to see happen particularly in a company that has the ear of such a large audience of young people. So I think I lost track of the question, but perhaps I've gone halfway to answer it.
No, that's great. Colin also asked, what would we lose from if we moved to deconsumerism that would really hurt us? In fact, would there be anything?
That's a really interesting question, but I mean, I think at least initially, it would hurt us. It would be a difficult transition, is maybe the better way to put it. For example, I mean, I talked about that period early in the pandemic, when people were locked out of consumer culture, and you saw this big shift towards these more intrinsically satisfying values. It didn't last, did it? People did eventually go back to shopping online and having things delivered to their homes. So much so that I've talked to some consumer waste experts who say that they call it the browning of the waste stream, because so many Amazon boxes entered the waste stream that there was this browning that happened of the waste stream. So we enthusiastically have returned to consumption, because to a degree that I don't think very many of us realize, we're very good at being consumers. We're very good at building our identities around consumption. We're very good at expressing ourselves to other people, and expressing our place in society, and expressing our interests through our consumption. We do it in very sophisticated ways that aren't all terrible and greed-driven and materialistic in that classic sense, but they are materialistic. So I think that kind of transition would be very difficult to do. It's not very easy to go from being a master consumer to being somebody who navigates the world through a different value set. That's a complicated shift. I keep saying that we have been talking about simple living much too simply, and it's for reasons like that the kind of transition we're talking about when we talk about transitioning to a society that consumes less are major transitions and changes in virtually everything we do.
Relating to that thought on simple living, which I really enjoyed that bit in the book, do you think it would be easier to find simple living now because there's more to rebel against, or was it easier maybe a few decades ago to live simply because there were less distractions?
I actually think it's harder in many parts of the world to live simply now because of the cost of housing. So, going back to this idea of having few needs easily met, that works a lot better if housing does not cost an extraordinary amount of money. So the last time that there was sort of a broad movement in this direction was in the 1990s, when the voluntary simplicity and the downshifting movements were occurring, and they involved millions of people. Those movements, there was really, at one point, 1 in 5 Americans was saying that they were living with less and were happier to be doing so. So that was a huge movement, but it occurred at a time when you could pay your mortgage or rent a home for considerably less than we have to today. And so I talked to some people in America who have been practicing simple living since that time, and they've talked about that as one of their big challenges. If your goal is to have a different kind of life where you're not so committed to earning so much and working such long hours, that works, only up to the point that that you can still afford a home to live in. So I think it's gotten more challenging in that sense.
That's a really good point. Okay, so someone else, you mentioned universal basic income in the book alongside a lot of other important ideas. Do you think this is an essential part of a much slower economy so that no one's thrown into poverty and we can have that security?
I think it's, again, I'm not a policy guru, so I'm hesitant to say I think it's essential, but it strikes me as, very important. Likely to be very important, quite possibly essential. It's part of the reason for that is that part of the reason I say that is because I think it would be helpful to have people who are, if they are interested in living a relatively simple but adequate material life, I think it would be helpful to have people step out into a universal basic income. And then, there's more work to go around for those who do want to participate in the cash economy. I think that, the attitude we might have around ideas like universal basic income might be quite different. It might be less about protecting the vulnerable and more about celebrating people who are happy to make their lives at a simpler level, provided it provides, meets their basic material needs. That part I think is quite interesting.
So a technical question slightly. You mentioned what seemed like a software model for the Canadian economy. Could this be used as an education tool to be used more widely to develop learning and awareness about approaches to deconsumerize?
Yeah, I think it probably could. Peter Victor has updated that, his book, which is called in the back of the book. I'm remembering now the subtitle, which I quoted earlier. It's what is it? Now I can't remember either. Anyway, yes, I think that computer model could be really useful. And Peter Victor's he's updated that book, and he's updated it with Tim Jackson, who I'm sure many, if not all of you know, British economist. And so I don't think there is a model for the UK at this point, but even the Canadian model is very useful, I think, for kind of getting that sense of what is possible in terms of the kind of steps that might be taken to make a lower consuming society something that seems reasonable to pursue. So it would be great to see it turned into something more directly usable in education, for sure.
Right. And I think probably sort of a final question from me before we wrap up from the evening. What would you say was the most surprising or life-changing thing you learned whilst reading this book that you would like to be sort of the message that really stays with people?
I think for me, my biggest personal takeaway, I had been kind of pursuing a simple, despite my description of my very extensive travel schedule, I had been pursuing for a long time a simpler model of living, and I had found it fine, but perhaps not as deeply satisfying as I might have imagined. And what I realized through the research I did for this is that the reason for that was that I hadn't really invested effort into making that shift towards an alternative set of values. So the alternative, if you shift away from materialism and consumerism, you don't necessarily move in the direction of a new set of values. You might just end up in a void where, you're not pursuing materialism and consumerism, but you're not pursuing any other particular value direction either. So, recognizing that has changed my behavior, and I am making more efforts to, to actively pursue intrinsically satisfying activities. And it does make a huge difference. The way I've started describing it is like, if you cancel Christmas, but you don't replace it with anything, then it just leaves behind a hole. It's like nothing's happening. There's no celebration. There's no generosity. There's nothing. If you cancel Christmas and you replace it with a completely different model, then that can be deeply satisfying, right? So that for me was maybe the most important takeaway, was to actively start to invest in those values. And now I'm really starting to understand what people who actively practice voluntary simplicity are really getting out of their lives, and how they find that so very satisfying.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great one to end on, because I think that will resonate with a lot of us here in Bedford who essentially did have Christmas cancelled last year in a complete lockdown. And maybe that will inspire us to think what we can do with our first Christmas with our loved ones in 2 years that might be a bit different to normal. So I'd like to say, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much. That was brilliant. To let everyone know, your book, The Day the World Stopped Shopping, How Ending Consumerism Saves the Environment and Ourselves, is available now, where you can buy it, or of course borrow it from your local library. I would also, a few things to know, that this has been part of the Great Big Green Week, and there's lots of other events going on in Bedford nationwide, and you can check them out at greatbiggreenweek.com. BCCF has another event tomorrow night, if you've not had enough Zoom time, called Making the Most of COP26, Emboldening Leaders to Do Difficult Things, with Rob Patton. It's on carbon fee and dividend. Finally, from me, BCCF will be at the Vegan Fair on Saturday, starting at 10 a.m. in Harper Square. We will be doing a green book, seed and plant swap. And for anyone that sees something they like but doesn't have anything to swap, of course, your donations are always welcome. So please come and say hi. Let us know what you thought about the talk. Come have a look. We would love to see you. I will quickly pass over to Lucy for any final announcements. But James, thank you. It was an absolute pleasure to have you.
It was a real pleasure to be here. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, James. Thank you, Pip, as well. Pip's covered most of the housekeeping, which is great, because there's a lot going on this week with Great Big Green Week. You might know that it's a national thing overseen by the Climate Coalition, of which Bedfordshire Climate Change Forum is a member. But we've got lots of things going on, not just in Bedford, but in Bedfordshire. So if you have a look around, you will find all sorts of things going on, big and small. And as Pip said, you can find them on the national website. Or I've also put in the chat the Great Big Green Week Bedford dedicated website, which has most of the events on, including tomorrow night. So do come tomorrow night if you can. It's at 7:30, and it's about carbon fee and dividends. So it complements really nicely what James has been talking about. I was scribbling things down from your book, James, and one of I wrote so many phrases down that I thought, I love this. This makes so much sense. It was like the new Bible, I think. One of them was make prices tell the truth. This is about carbon fee and dividend, which we're talking about tomorrow night, and as a campaign tool for COP26 in Glasgow. So if you can come, do come. You can sign up on Eventbrite. You'll find how to do that on the link just there on Great Big Green Week. Just one other thing to mention, Thursday, if you're in Bedford, I know a lot of you aren't in Bedfordshire, but if you are in Bedford, you can come to the Green Earth Cafe on 13th St Paul's Square. Between 10 and 12, there'll be a kind of climate coffee morning, which is really a chance to talk to other people about ideas, inspiration, grief, despair, hope, optimism, however you're feeling on Thursday morning. But also Bedford's MP will be there briefly at the beginning. So if you want to have a chat with him, bend his ear. The more people that drop in and see him, the better, so that he knows local people care about this, and that they care about how this country stands up at COP26. So if I know it's a bit awkward Thursday morning, but if you can make that, that would be wonderful. Tell your friends. It's all there on the website, as I've said, and I think that's it. So there were 42 people tonight, which is not bad, but if everyone can spread the word, and also we will have the recording up on our YouTube channel in a couple of days, and that will be shared via the Eventbrite email. So you'll get an email from Eventbrite, which will share that link with you. And it will also be on our Bedfordshire Climate Change website address, which I will type in here. And there you go. So you can find it on there as well. I think that's it. So thank you so much, James. It's been so fascinating. There's so much to think about, and my copy of the book is going to be lent widely. And thank you again, Pip. Take care.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great evening, and hopefully we'll see you at an event soon.
So I don't know, Pip, can you hear? Is she gone?
I can hear.
Yes, I think just my last link, it went direct to Diana. We had a problem at the beginning because Diana's messages she was sending them just to me by mistake.
Yeah, I wondered if there was something wrong with
It was
it.
only Diana, so I could see other messages, but that one was just coming, and I kept saying to they're just coming to me, and she said, so
Let's
by
end the
accident.
recording, I think.
Yeah, I can yeah, in fact, let's
do that.
I can trim this bit.
I can do it probably if you want.
Thanks, Colin. So yeah, the
Let's be. No, yeah. No,
when I put the link in at the end, it only went to Diana because
no, I haven't ended it somehow. It's not worked. Are you sure?
I'm not sure